Well, speaking of rolling along, the last topic we wanted to cover today before our Out There segment is the arrest, detention, and torture. That's right, I said torture, of Julian Assange. Now, as you all know, Ecuador recently withdrew its grant of asylum to Mr. Assange and allowed the British authorities to storm its embassy and literally carry Mr. Assange out in handcuffs. Surely we've all seen the video by now. Well, there is some news. Firstly, as you will remember, the DOJ had previously only charged Assange on a single count of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Well, as we predicted, DOJ's upped the ante last week and charged Assange with an additional 18 counts, including espionage. These new counts are enough to put Julian Assange in jail in the U.S. for decades. While the federal prosecutor has gone to great lengths to urge that Assange is not being charged for publishing the diplomatic cables, that argument falls completely flat. The prosecutor argues that, quote, it was explicitly stated in the State Department cables that the identity of sources was to be protected and that, quote, Assange was warned by the State Department not to release the names, but he did so nevertheless. Well, this argument is illogical. If the government could prevent a publisher from publishing secret government materials simply by explicitly stating that the publisher must redact some information, that turns the entire state of the law on its head. In reality, the argument DOJ is advancing is specious. That means it makes no sense and is a joke. But of course, you don't hear the mainstream media challenging the Department of Justice on making an illogical, specious argument. Instead, the media laps up the BS and regurgitates it onto us in a constant stream of propaganda with the obvious philosophy that a lie repeated often enough becomes truth. Now, you may be aware that Assange is currently being held in a British prison called HMP Belmarsh. And you got to love the way the Brits name things, because it always involves His Majesty, or in this case, Her Majesty. And in this case, HMP means Her Majesty's Prison. So HMP Belmarsh means Her Majesty's Prison, Belmarsh. Now, this is the UK equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. That's where they keep all their high-value prisoners and, serious terrorists. What you probably have not been told is that Julian Assange is being treated, and we need to put treated because that really should probably be tortured. We need to put that in quotes. But he's being treated with a brutal regime of mind-altering drugs. The particular drug of choice is called 3-quinculidinyl benzylate, also known as BZ. And it's apparently a favorite of that torture queen herself, the current CIA director, Gina Haspel. Some, including myself, would classify this treatment as torture. In fact, repeated dosings of the drugs that Assange is being given typically result in permanent brain damage. And that can range from a loss of memory up to a full chemical lobotomy, rendering Julian Assange permanently incapable of interacting with other people or testifying. Why do you think it might be in someone's interest to erase Julian Assange's mind? The chemical they're using on him is the equivalent of the bleach bit program that Hillary Clinton used on her illegal homebrew server. As longtime listeners of this show well know, Julian Assange has all but stated that Wikileaks received the DNC documents, that means John Podesta's emails and all the alleged hacked emails from the DNC. Assange has said that WikiLeaks got those from Seth Rich. Also, a group headed by a famed former NSA agent named Bill Binney has analyzed the electronic files, and that group has concluded that the files were downloaded to a local storage device by a DNC insider, such as downloaded to a thumb drive by Seth Rich, rather than being hacked by foreign intelligence services over the internet. The group that performed the analysis is called VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and it's worth noting that the leader of that group, Bill Binney, is the single most decorated agent in the history of the NSA and is considered to be a hero in U.S. intelligence circles and really across the country at large. He's the guy that invented the electronic surveillance system, and he's the same guy who resigned from his position shortly after 9/11 when the system that he invented to spy on the rest of the world was actually turned to spy on American citizens, and he resigned in protest. He's one of the original whistleblowers. He preceded Edward Snowden, and he's a man of the utmost integrity and absolutely impeccable character. So, Benny's group VIPs concluded that it had to be an inside job, and no one has ever presented any convincing refutation to that conclusion. Simply put, that's because the DNC was in fact never hacked by the Russians. It simply didn't happen. If you carefully examine the statements in the sideshow that was the Mueller investigation, you find that the FBI never investigated the alleged hacking and that the DNC abjectly refused to even turn over its server to the FBI for investigation. Instead, the DNC convinced the media and others to simply accept as fact a report made by a DNC contractor called CrowdStrike. Does this sound at all familiar? Gee, this sure sounds like the same deal as the Fusion GPS dossier, doesn't it? Let's see. The DNC paid Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele to make up the dossier out of whole cloth, it turns out, and the DNC gets the mainstream media and large parts of U.S. intelligence and law enforcement services to simply accept, on good faith, the salacious and unverified dossier. Heck, heads of the U.S. intelligence community and law enforcement even signed multiple verified applications to the FISA court that were based on the unverified and salacious Fusion GPS Steele dossier. Of course, these so-called professionals did not bother to inform the FISA court that the dossier was salacious and unverified. And I'm looking at you, Jim Comey. Hopefully we can all see the rank hypocrisy in using salacious and unverified material as part of a verified application. Remember this because you will be under a media onslaught trying to brainwash you into believing that the leaders of the FBI and the Department of Justice and the CIA did not know exactly what they were doing. They knew this material was unverified, and it seems they also knew it was in fact untrue, as is coming out now. So it's a lot worse than what you would call a mistake. This was a knowing attempt to take down a presidential candidate and then a sitting president. This was treason, and John Brennan, James Comey, Jim Clapper, and others all knew about it. Heck, they planned it. So while we have sat here for years listening to John Brennan and James Comey claim that the president had committed treason, all the while it seems that it was they who had committed treason. Both of them, note, are admitted former communists. And what was the one rule of communism? That the ends justify the means, that there is no God and no objective morality, that whatever it takes to win, including breaking the law, is just what the game requires. These are communist values perfectly demonstrated by a couple of communists. And given the administration in which they both served and operated, the administration of one Barack Hussein Obama, who many people accuse of being a closeted Marxist, is it any surprise? Put another way, let me ask you a question. Do birds of a feather flock together? Now, I want to circle back to a question we didn't answer with respect to Julian Assange. That is the question of whether Wikileaks and Julian Assange are journalists and entitled to the protection of the freedom of the press. The reason I'm addressing this particular question is that recently several colleagues of mine have indicated that their views on the Assange situation turn on their evaluations that Julian Assange and Wikileaks are not journalists and are therefore not entitled to the protection of journalists. I would urge them and you to consider whether this conclusion actually holds merit. Instead, I believe that Julian Assange and Wikileaks are clearly journalists and are clearly engaging in journalism. In order to make my argument, I want to compare what WikiLeaks has done to what's been done by others who are accepted as journalists. Firstly, it's never been a crime in this country for a journalist to publish a document that is given to the journalist by a source, even if the source stole the document or if the document was a classified document. Essentially, that's all that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did. They published documents that were given to them by Bradley Manning and others. The documents provided by Manning happened to show that some members of the military may have engaged in extrajudicial killings in wartime, which are commonly called war crimes. This information is plainly newsworthy, and although it is something the U.S. military obviously would prefer not to share with the American public or the world populace, it is the truth. Even where the truth is not pretty, there is still a public value to truth, as opposed to deception being known and believed. So, while it may hurt the U.S. military's reputation at home and abroad, it is healthy that the truth came out, and in fact, it's better in the long run for the military to deal with the truth than to be able to ignore it by keeping it covered up. Now, we're coming up on a hard break, but the story isn't finished yet. I've got some great examples for you that prove why I think Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are both journalists. We're going to cover those when we come back on the Morgan Streetman Show on Money Talk 1010. We'll be right back. And on the other side of the break, we were talking about Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, and the question of whether or not Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are journalists. So now what I wanted to do for you is to share with you a few examples of other folks who have been determined to be journalists who've done the same kind of stuff that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have done. A very similar example of this would be the Pentagon Papers. As many of us will remember, the Pentagon Papers were a detailed study of the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam that was put together by the Pentagon. Well, the papers were illegally released by Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the study, and they were first brought to the attention of the American public on the pages of the New York Times in 1971. Basically, the Pentagon Papers showed that President Lyndon Johnson's administration had systematically lied to both the American public and to Congress about the Vietnam War. Now, you tell me, is it a good thing that the president and military lied to the American people in Congress for many years? Is that a good thing? And if someone like Daniel Ellsberg in the New York Times tells us about the lying and shows us the truth, is that a good thing? Or would we be better off if we were still believing the lies? Is there any real question here, folks? Do you really want to be lied to? How about the multi-part story published in 1997 in the San Jose Mercury News and Observer, which used to be one of the greatest papers in this country? That story was by Gary Webb and was called Dark Alliance. It was actually one of the first interactive online news stories where source documents were linked to throughout the article so that readers could trust but verify. Webb and the Mercury News published source documents showing that the CIA was involved in trafficking cocaine into the United States in the 1980s. Apparently, our CIA was doing this in order to get money to fund the Nicaraguan Contras. And you may remember some limited public hearings on the matter involving Oliver North, who was the CIA asset, running what would become known colloquially as the Iran-Contras. Anyway, Gary Webb dragged this stinking mess of corruption and crime out into the open, and he did so using the source documents. From his reporting, we learned that it was the CIA who developed and funded Freeway Rick Ross's crack cocaine distribution network in Los Angeles in the 1980s. Again, I ask whether you would prefer that these lies stay hidden. I know the many families in Watts and South Central Los Angeles felt like they had finally been heard after many years of being ignored. They knew something foul was afoot in their community, but the media and government treated them like they were crazy conspiracy theorists. And now we know the truth. And this is just exactly what WikiLeaks has done. WikiLeaks has pulled back the blindfold from our eyes and shown us the truth. Let's examine another, more recent example. Remember Edward Snowden? Remember how he stole documents from his employer and the NSA and released them to the American public through Glenn Greenwald and The Intercept? These documents again informed us, the people, that our government was lying to us. Are you noticing a pattern here, folks? The documents told us that while our government had claimed it wasn't wholesale spying on us, in fact, that was exactly and essentially all it had been doing for decades. Again, Snowden revealed documents that proved that our government was lying to us. Remember how Glenn Greenwald and The Intercept were considered journalists for releasing and publishing the documents given to them by Edward Snowden? They did the exact same thing that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have done. But no one seriously questions whether Glenn Greenwald is a journalist and whether he should be tried for espionage. Indulge me in one last example to make my argument. Do you remember the Panama Papers? Yeah, that was that trove of attorney-client privilege documents that were stolen from Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca and given to a group of journalists. The documents showed, behind the scenes, how the wealthy and powerful in this world move and hide their money internationally to avoid taxes and creditors. The entire trove of documents was published online, and various media outlets reported on it. Exactly how is that any different from what WikiLeaks did? It isn't. That's because Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are journalists, and they were engaged in the profession of journalism when they published documents that the government wanted kept secret, when they uncovered the hidden realities of war and the fact that war always includes war crimes, and when they dragged the stinking corpse of the covered-up war crimes out into the sunshine for we the people, the American public, to see. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.